Hello everyone, and welcome to another program in the At Home series here on Viking.TV. My name is Alastair, and this behind me is my home in the Normandy countryside in the north of France. But before I lived here, I spent 20 years living in another place, a place that's very dear to me and will always be one of the big loves of my life. And that's where I'd like to take you today. This is not going to be a history lesson or a guided tour. I just want to show you some of the quiet places that I like to go to in a very big, noisy and crowded city. So let's go, or as we say in French, on y va. If you are lucky enough to have lived in Paris as a young man, then wherever you go for the rest of your life, it stays with you, for Paris is a movable feast. So said Ernest Hemingway. And well, I did live in Paris as a young man, and yes, my time in this city will stay with me for the rest of my life. I first came to Paris one very cold Christmas in 1986. A friend had lent me her apartment, and I had only intended to stay for a week, but the city cast its spell on me. And before you could say ooh la la, 1 week became 20 years. So what was it that kept me here all that time, held tight in the grip of Paris? Well, I'd spent a lot of my youth watching French films by directors such as Godard, Truffaut, Renoir, Roma and others. The kind of films where for long periods of time, nothing much seems to happen, where couples meet and separate and spend long periods in cafes wearing black turtleneck sweaters and smoking a lot of gouloirs and talking about their existential problems. And to me back then, well, it all looked wonderfully existentially charming. So living in Paris was to be living inside a film, my film, of which I was both the director and the star, with all the inhabitants of the city seemingly playing their roles to perfection. There is a wonderful word in French, flâneur, which roughly translates as to wander aimlessly and without apparent purpose, at once attached and separate from one's surroundings. And this is what I'll be doing today, a flâneur in Paris. Today I decided to start my aimless wandering in one of the places I like to come to when I seek refuge from the noise and press of the city, starting here in the Luxembourg Gardens. When I first arrived in Paris back in 1986, I couldn't speak a word of French, so as you do, I signed up for some lessons from a language school. And every morning on my way from home to school, I'd have to cross these classical French gardens. They seemed incredibly elegant to me back then, and coming here today, they're still beautiful. We have Marie de Medici to thank for all this. At the beginning of the 17th century, after the assassination of her husband, King Henry IV, she began constructing her new palace and gardens. Queen Marie was born in Florence, a member of the powerful Medici family, and spent most of her childhood there, in the Pitti Palace and the Bourdelle Gardens, and these were her inspiration for what we have here today. My favorite place to come to in the Luxembourg Gardens is right here, the Medici Fountain. To my mind, the most beautiful fountain in all of Paris. Here, the jealous, one-eyed Polyphemus stares down angrily at the lovers, Acis and Galatea. We are on the cusp of spring now. There are no leaves on the trees just yet, but it's around the corner. And when it comes, it'll bring with it the children and their toy sailboats, the picnickers, the chess players, the just met couples, the Tai Chi classes, the students from the nearby Sorbonne, the lonely and the lost, seeking some moments of peace and distraction. On Paris's left bank, almost literally in the shadow of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, is a bookstore unlike any other. Opened by George Whitman in 1951, this English language bookstore quickly became a focal point of literary culture in Bohemian Paris. The roll call of great writers who have visited, worked, or even lived here is a veritable who's who of 20th century Anglo-American literary achievement. From James Joyce to Henry Miller, from Allen Ginsberg to James Baldwin, many were the lost souls taken in by the generosity of Shakespeare and Company. Aspiring but penniless writers, known as tumbleweeds, have long been given refuge here, provided with free lodgings in return for working in the bookstore. If you love literature, you'll love this place. It's stuffed full to bursting with books, and today it's hard to imagine a Paris without Shakespeare and Company. Before moving to Paris, when I wasn't spending whole afternoons watching French movies, I'd be hanging out in the bookstores of London. So whenever I come into Paris these days, I'll make time to visit this veritable institution of the city. If I could live my life all over again, then I think that instead of becoming a photographer, I would be a sculptor. Much as I love photography, I really miss that third dimension. So let me take you now to the first museum I visited when I came to live in Paris, tucked away in the 15th arrondissement. Around the end of the 19th century, this became the home and studio of one Antoine Bourdelle. And what I love about this place, and the reason I return to it, is not only for the sculptures, but because, like the Luxembourg Gardens, it's a place for quiet contemplation. Antoine Bourdelle was born in 1861 in the south of France and was so gifted in drawing that his art teacher gave him carte blanche to draw whatever he wished. And aged 15, he was given a scholarship to the Toulouse School of Fine Arts. And after 8 years of solitude and feverish hard work, he came to the Paris Fine Arts School and quickly moved into a studio right here in what is now the museum bearing his name. After a year of working as an assistant to the great Auguste Rodin, he left and began to develop his own form of classical, refined sculpture. Here in the great hall, Bourdelle's plaster casts, some of them enormous, are bathed in a soft light. And out in the garden, bronze statues, inert, silent, and steadfast, under the gaze of the city that has grown up around them. In the past, I've been here when it's raining, and the statues become even more beautiful as the wet green bronze glistens. Constructed in 1804, when this would have been on the outskirts of the city, Père Lachaise is Paris's largest cemetery and could lay claim to being the world's most famous burial ground. It's certainly one of the most visited. There's a long list of 19th and 20th century celebrities who were at rest here in the largest green space in Paris. Built on a hillside with thousands of trees and gently winding paths, I like to get hopelessly lost here amongst the fanciful tombs and gravestones of the great and the good. When the cemetery was first constructed, it was considered too far from the city, so the administrators came up with a clever marketing strategy to attract more business. They transferred here the remains of some of the most illustrious celebrities of the day, and soon people were clamoring to be buried alongside these famous citizens. Oscar Wilde is here, his tomb now protected by glass. He came to France after being found guilty of gross indecency in England and was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor there. On the day of his release, he fled to France, but his time in prison had broken his health, and after 3 years of impoverished exile, he died in Paris. When I first came here, the tomb was covered in red lipstick kisses left by Oscar Wilde's admirers. It's since been cleaned up and now has glass surrounding it. Behind these fences lies another protected grave of a more recent iconic artist, the American singer and songwriter Jim Morrison. He was found dead in his bathtub in his Parisian apartment, but before he died, Morrison would take long walks in Père Lachaise, and as an idol of Oscar Wilde, decided he too wanted to be buried here. And still today, fans of Morrison, his songwriting and his music come here from around the world. One of the strangest tombs in this cemetery has to be this one, the grave of Victor Noir. Victor Noir was a young French journalist who in 1870 was shot by Napoleon's nephew after an argument. The sculptor of his tomb was very generous with a certain part of his anatomy. There is a long-held myth in Paris that says that if a woman places a flower in the top hat, kisses the lips and rubs the genital area, well then, she will soon become pregnant. I couldn't leave Père Lachaise without a quick visit to see the grave of that most quintessentially French singer, the legendary Edith Piaf. Nicknamed the Little Sparrow, the diminutive Piaf was born just down the road from here. But after a life of sadness, tragedy and addiction, she died in 1963, just 47 years old. And at her funeral, tens of thousands of people came to pay their last respects. Her songs are still regularly played on French radio, and it's impossible not to be stirred by hearing her singing her most famous one, Non, je ne regrette rien. So what is it about this city of light that makes my heart beat a little faster and gives me a frisson of excitement whenever I come back to it? As cities go, Paris is small, and it's crowded and noisy and getting more and more expensive. Parisians can be arrogant, judgmental and self-obsessed, though I never found French waiters to be quite as bad as they're made out to be. You need a thick skin to live here, but the compensations are many. There's a weight of history in Paris, of kings and emperors, of revolution and occupation. Men on horseback silently watch over you. If you let it, Paris can be an ongoing process of seduction, by a smile on the metro trains, by the smell of just baked bread wafting out from the back of the boulangerie, by the crispness of a cafe waiter's apron or the notes from a violin tumbling down from a fifth-floor window. A city where past, present and future entwine themselves. A small city, bite-sized, easy to walk across in half a day. A city where people still live and work in the centre, and small shops and cafes and restaurants struggle on, where children go to schools and there is a sense of community. A place where, as the writer Sam White once wrote, a civilized man can partake of civilized pleasures in a civilized manner, in a civilized setting. He wrote that in 1977, but I think it more or less holds true. And as Humphrey Bogart tells Ingrid Bergman at the end of the film Casablanca, we'll always have Paris.